What does it feel like to carry a weapon that terrifies even the bravest soldiers, but at the same time makes you the most hunted man on the battlefield? For flamethrower operators in World War II, this wasn't a hypothetical question. The second they entered combat, they were walking firestorms, and everyone knew it. But here's the catch. Despite their terrifying power, flamethrowers were one of the most dangerous, short-lived, and psychologically scarring weapons of the entire war. So today we're looking at what life was really like for the men who carried flamethrowers in World War II, how they fought, how they were used, and why their survival rates were so grim. Flamethrowers have a reputation unlike almost any other weapon. Machine guns and mortars could kill, sure, but flamethrowers did something else. They burned. They created firestorms in bunkers, trenches, and forests. They didn't just kill, they terrified. Soldiers on both sides admitted that nothing sent shivers down their spine like hearing the roar of a flamethrower igniting. Even if you weren't hit, the sight alone could make entire units abandon fortified positions without firing a shot. But here's the ugly truth. For the operator, the flamethrower was a death sentence. At first glance, carrying a flamethrower seems powerful. You're armed with a weapon that can shoot streams of burning liquid up to 40 meters away. But look closer. The fuel tanks strapped to the operator's back weren't just heavy, often weighing around 70 pounds. They were also highly flammable. One stray bullet, piece of shrapnel, or even a lucky grenade fragment could ignite them instantly, turning the operator into a human torch. That made them priority targets. Snipers, machine gunners, artillery crews, everyone aimed for the flamethrower operator the moment they appeared. In many battles, operators didn't survive their first few minutes of combat. One US Marine veteran summed it up bluntly. If you carried a flamethrower, you were dead. Flamethrowers weren't new to World War II. The Germans had experimented with them in World War I, unleashing them in trench warfare with devastating effect. By World War II, almost every major army had developed some version. The Germans fielded the Flammenwerfer 35, and later the lighter Flammenwerfer 41. The Americans introduced the M1, and later the more reliable M2. The Japanese had their own versions too, though less effective. But no matter the model, the principle was the same. A man carrying tanks of fuel connected to a hose and nozzle, projecting liquid fire under pressure. The design differences didn't matter much when it came to survival, because the operator was still a man with a giant target painted on his back. So how were they actually used? Flamethrowers weren't general infantry weapons. They were assault tools meant for one thing: clearing bunkers, pillboxes, caves, and trenches. On D-Day, US flamethrower teams were crucial for taking out German fortifications along Omaha and Utah Beach. In the Pacific, Marines carried flamethrowers against heavily entrenched Japanese forces in places like Iwo Jima and Peleliu, where enemies refused to surrender. But this came with brutal consequences. Unlike rifles or artillery, flamethrowers killed in the most horrifying way imaginable. Soldiers who used them often saw enemy troops running out of bunkers in flames, screaming, and sometimes taking minutes to die. Even hardened veterans admitted that the psychological toll of using a flamethrower was almost unbearable. It wasn't just killing the enemy, it was killing them in the most horrific way possible. Because flamethrowers were so heavy, operators moved slower than other infantry. And once they lit up, they were impossible to miss. German machine gunners, Soviet snipers, and Japanese riflemen would drop everything to take out the flamethrower first. The logic was simple: kill the operator and you eliminate one of the most devastating weapons on the field. In fact, on Iwo Jima, out of nearly 380 flamethrower operators, only 18 survived the battle. That's a survival rate of less than 5%. Their life expectancy in combat was sometimes measured in minutes, not hours. If being a flamethrower operator wasn't already terrifying enough, there was another layer: the nightmares they carried long after the war. Unlike a rifleman who might never know if his shots hit the enemy, a flamethrower operator saw everything. He saw men burning alive, he heard their screams, and he knew exactly what he had done. Many veterans admitted they could never forget those moments. Some broke down after battles, others refused to speak about their experiences even decades later. One Marine put it simply, it wasn't war, it was hell. There was also another terrifying reality. If you were captured while carrying a flamethrower, your chances of survival were basically zero. Both in Europe and the Pacific, flamethrower operators were seen as monsters. Enemies who might have surrendered to regular riflemen would often execute flamethrower troops on the spot. They were considered too dangerous, too hated to live. That made the job even more isolating. Not only were you likely to die in combat, but if you were unlucky enough to be captured, you weren't coming back. As if enemy fire wasn't enough, flamethrowers could kill their own users. Leaks in the fuel tanks, faulty igniters, or just a bad hit could ignite the operator instantly. Many stories describe flamethrower troops being consumed in seconds by their own weapon. Even the blast from firing could be dangerous. Operators had to be careful about backblast, terrain, and even wind direction, or risk setting themselves and their squad on fire. By the late stages of World War II, and especially after, flamethrowers began to disappear from armies. They were too dangerous, too heavy, and too inhumane. The US used them again in Korea and Vietnam, but by the 1970s, most militaries had retired them in favor of flamethrower tanks, or fuel-air explosives, which didn't risk a man carrying the weapon. Today, flamethrowers are considered obsolete in modern warfare, replaced by safer and more efficient weapons. But their reputation, both terrifying and tragic, still lives on. Being a flamethrower operator was one of the most dangerous, short-lived and mentally scarring roles of World War II. They carried the power to clear entire bunkers, but at the cost of becoming the battlefield's #1 target. Their survival rates were grim, their experiences were haunting, and for many, the scars lasted a lifetime. It wasn't just a job, it was a death sentence.